All right, guys, welcome back. This is our fourth installment of this COVID Ops webinar series. Really excited about this one. Honestly, I think this probably came together better than anyone we've done yet. So hopefully, I hit the nail on this one. But after talking with a bunch of coaches over the last couple of weeks here, kind of came to the realization that this is really what people are most interested in, and I guess what sticks out with what I'm posting and whatnot. And I certainly don't have a shortage of things to talk about when we discuss fascia. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Just a quick note for your viewing purposes, and because this material is a little bit denser, I'll probably be breaking this up into like 2 or 3 subsequent parts. So I'll film it one time, one shot through, and then probably just break them up into smaller individual videos to post so that that's not too overwhelming. But with that said, presentation goals today. We're going to get into the overview or an overview of the fascial system, but do know this is not an anatomy presentation, nor am I the right person to give a fascial anatomy presentation. We're going to focus more on the training side of things and training applications, but we will examine some of the anatomy stuff. In addition to that, we'll look at some of the properties, mechanical and otherwise, that fascia has, and kind of some of the lesser known items that I try to consider when I'm putting programs together and training and such. So before we get to that, just wanted to be very clear on this. And I know it's tough with some of the social media posts and stuff because context is so limited, but just wanted to be very clear on this, that the fascial system is one of many. It has its own roles, and it is a wide-reaching system, but it is just one of many. So even as much of a bias as I may have, it's important to keep that in mind. Muscles are still extremely important. We still have to load heavy. We still have to be adept in conventional patterns and in traditional planes. Really, my stance is just that the fascial system is under-recognized and underutilized in terms of training and movement signatures and things. So, it has a tremendous contribution for performance and function. So, a couple of quotes here to kind of set the tone for what we're going to be diving into here today. This first one here from Bill Parisi. For years, coaches have fixated on increasing power by making athletes stronger without appreciating the significance of the underlying fascia system and how it works to harness, distribute, and amplify forces across the body. Another one here from Tom Myers. Fascial elasticity is important because most tearing injuries occur when connective tissue is stretched faster than it can respond. The greater the imbalance between the muscular and fascial systems, the higher the chance for injury. And finally, one from Stu McGill here. Be careful with things like stretching. Use stretching not for mobility, but to tune your fascial system and to get it to play with the neurology of pulse release elastic energy. So just kind of keep those 3 quotes in mind as we're going through this. I'll touch back on these, but really these are 3 quotes that really gravitated and kind of caught my attention as I was going through some of their work that really started to kind of lead me to exploring fascia a little bit more. And right on cue here, these are, in my opinion, 3 non-negotiable fascia resources. Most people are familiar with the incredible work of Thomas Myers and his team with anatomy trains. This one here, I shit you not, was really the biggest game-changing book that I've read for training. I don't know, since like maybe Triphasic from Cal, 5 or 6 years ago. This is an incredibly well-written book, and it's a much easier, comprehensive read, a little bit less technical. And then this one over here on the opposite end, Bio-tensegrity from Graham Scarr is extremely technical. This is a pretty heavy read, but very interesting and tons of great info in there as well. So I'm going to reference these 3 books throughout the presentation here today quite heavily. So let me just go ahead and cite my work ahead of time and say that the majority of what we're going to be discussing here has come from these 3 sources here. So in addition to that, some other research. These are just a couple of good studies that I've found here recently that I think help to really get a better understanding of the behavior of fascia. But I'll link these, and I'll link the book the books on the previous slide in the description underneath, so you'll have access to those as well. Diving into what we have here today, starting out with just kind of a broad intro to fascia. So fascia is an extracellular collagenous matrix, and it envelops every single fiber, muscle fiber, soft tissue, cell structure, everything throughout the human body. It literally wraps and integrates everything throughout the human body, and we'll have some pictures on that to kind of help illustrate that here in a second. When you think about the fascia system, we want to think of it as a support structure, and something that is heavily involved in producing and managing both internal and external forces. With that, the four main properties of fascia, we're going to cover these pretty extensively here. The four main properties of fascia are plasticity, elasticity, viscosity, and remodeling, and we'll get into those here in a sec as well. Interesting note here, and I actually came across this as putting this all together. But it's been recently shown that the fascial system has about 6 times the amount of proprioceptive bodies and nerve fibers or nerve endings when compared to muscles. So take that for what it's worth, but that's something that I put a tremendous priority on with my population, especially being so injury ridden and really lacking multiplanar proficiency. And kind of tying it all together, it's just a very complex system, and we still have a ton of shit to learn about the fascial system, and especially on the performance side, there's a pretty good amount of research on more of the medical and the rehabilitative side right now, but I think we need to put a little bit more attention to fascia and how it is involved in performance measures. So when most people think about fascia, right, what do we think about? Well, we think about a foam roller. We think about trigger points, and I got to be honest, I didn't even know what the hell fascia blasting was prior to putting this little presentation together, but apparently like the most common association with fascia is actually for like cellulite and like dermal purposes. But when we think about fascia, we want to think more along these lines. So a lot of people will reference the netting of an orange, right? So basically just what keeps all of the contents of the orange intact and together. Other people like to think about a spider web, or more of like the glue properties of fascia and kind of the webbing in this, myofascial bag type of thought process. For me personally, I think about the chaos theory or the butterfly effect, and I think that is both a good illustrative metaphor and also an application metaphor. The fascial system really is so wide-reaching and is involved with or coexists with so many of the other biological systems, that it really just has wide-sweeping ramifications in a lot of different ways. So I personally like to think of the chaos theory or the butterfly effect. And then this is a nice little illustration that I came across that I think helps to kind of illustrate the direction of fabrics or the direction of tissues. We think about pennation angles with muscles. I think we need to kind of take that a step further and think about the direction of the fascia or the fabric of the connective tissue and how it all kind of seams together. And what that really becomes is a term called bio-tensegrity. We've seen tensegrity structures, that look similar to this. Kids' toys, art pieces. It's actually a very common tensegrity is a very common application for a lot of different construction, but it also applies to the human body. So bio-tensegrity is an important term to be aware of when we're talking about fascia. And with bio-tensegrity, which it basically goes against Newtonian physics to some extent, we don't want to think as much as in terms of like levers as much. We want to think more compression and tension, struts and cables, and understanding that this is a non-linear behavior that is dependent on time. So putting that into a cool little graph here, thinking about fascia, collagenous matrix, we're thinking about that remodeling property. For plasticity, we're thinking about resisting, reforming, and reshaping. With elasticity, we're thinking about storing and releasing kinetic energies. Viscosity, we're thinking about the friction or the glide between tissues. We want to understand that fascia is a global proprioceptive organ. That's a really important one. And also that it has reflexive properties that implicate both the central and autonomic nervous systems. This little graph here is from a YouTube video from a gentleman named Chris DiPrato. He's actually got an incredible presentation on YouTube. I'll link that too. Discussing some of the components that make up fascia. This is a short list here, some of the bigger ticket items, but we're looking at fibroblasts, collagen fibers, elastic fibers, reticular fibers, and ground substance. So for fibroblasts, we're looking at, building connective tissue, one of the quintessential structures in building connective tissue. Collagen fibers are a big one. This is really, what makes or breaks the connective tissue. So we're thinking about cross-linking and tensile strength. This is where we can revert back to that spider web image. The elastic fibers, this is more the tendinous properties. So we're thinking about rubber-like proteins and that, being that ability to distend and then reform back to normal shape. The reticular fibers are what connect the vessels and the nerves. So they're a little bit more pliable than something like collagen. And then the ground substance is kind of just, the space that all of these structures kind of exist in. So with that, we have some health and wellness factors that we want to be aware of here with fascia. It's not just about training intent and therapeutic modalities. We also have to cover our bases here. So, hydration and nutrition is a big one. Obviously, hydration being a major part of that, considering it's, a watery based tissue. Our stress and emotional management is a major player here. I'm not going to get into it in this discussion, but I would definitely encourage you to go do your own research on the linkage between the fascial system and emotional memory storage. I'll leave it at that for now. Ground substance that we were just talking about on the previous slide, that's where we're thinking about lymphatic function and our ability to process toxins. If we have a bunch of toxins in our system, it's gonna disrupt the fascial glide. Back to that proprioceptive aspect, we're also gonna have vestibular function as a player here, and sleep duration quality. This is our repair process. It's no different for fascia than it is for any other tissue. Sleep duration and quality are both highly important. And then really also to, just daily activity rates, and, what do your static and working postures look like? What are the physical demands that you're exposed to or subjected to? These are all going to be considerations for the tissue quality. When we're thinking about fascia, we have to understand that there are multiple layers, and each has different responsibilities and ramifications. But what we want to look at here is also the hyaluronic acid, which is an important component to this. Hyaluronic acid is basically what allows your tissues to glide on a frictionless surface and to move in the full ranges that they're supposed to move. So if we have, sticking between deep and superficial fascias, it's going to constrict the ability to not only produce but move hyaluronic acid. So a lot of the times that's what contributes to that feeling of tightness and stiffness and not feeling right. But really, what you want to know when we're looking at, or when we're talking about hyaluronic acid, is it can be like water or it can be like glue. It really just depends on all of those different health and wellness factors that we were talking about a second ago. But we obviously want to be more like water than like glue, although there are certain areas where we do want more or less stiffness. But paths of motion that get neglected in training become liabilities for injury and action. If tissues can't move when they need to move, it's going to be a propagator for injury risk. And the best ways to promote HA is in training is really just multiplanar, free flow type movement, We're thinking deep range mobility, flexibility movements under load, and then some soft tissue modalities. I didn't get too deep into the soft tissue modalities because of the you know conflicting opinions or ideologies surrounding them. But we're thinking about things like cupping and dry needling and rolling and stuff like that. But whichever one sticks out for you, or whichever you tend to find the most value in, all that's fair game. But really, what we're trying to do with that is we're just trying to get fluids moving, including this hyaluronic acid. Pretty cool image here. This is just looking at some different cadavers, looking at a couple of different layers of fascia. So, here we see the superficial fascia of the leg, and then down over here we can look at the deep fascia of the leg. This looking at more of the thoracic and abdominal cavities here. But what you should notice here is look at the striations of this and look at the deposits, right? So we see more up in the anterior deltoid here, and then we come down over the rib cage, and it's a little bit more thinned out and a little bit less bound up, and then rib cage coming down more into the abdomen and pec area here, pec line. So, from your abdominal wall all the way up through your deltoid, that is one continuous connective layer all the way through. So when we say things like, everything affects everything, or it's all connected, well, that's quite literal. This is a really beautiful image here. And then over here, we can, I think what they're trying to demonstrate is the distensibility or extensibility of fascia. I'm actually not too sure exactly what this is right here, but, if we look and see that tissue is able to pull away from the bone, pretty easily, but it'll, reform back into shape. So it's a really interesting material or tissue, and really just demonstrates a lot of unusual behaviors. These are a little bit more popular. These are some cool images too. These are taken directly from the Anatomy Trains textbook, but these are the superficial front and back lines. So if you look at this image here, flexor hallucis longus, we're looking down at the big toe here. We travel all the way up, and that is your tongue. So from the tip of your big toe to your tongue, there is one connective interwoven sheet of tissue. On the back line, we have similar, your plantar down here, coming all the way up through the calf and hamstring, all the way up to the semispinals and the cervicis. So again, just looking at the illustration here, not knowing anything else or not even looking or discussing anything training related, it just really made an impression on me to see, that is a very literal thing, that there's one connective tissue all the way from toe to tongue. The center of coordination, this is an interesting component to fascia as well, where basically, when we think about muscular contraction, we think about an axis point, we think about a moment arm, and then we think about a muscular contraction. Well, it's actually a little bit different than that with fascia. With fascia, it creates tension points or tension lines. So if we look at like the calf Achilles complex here, we have the Achilles tendon coming up, calf muscles here. Instead of just looking at the calf contracting itself, we need to consider where the point in the tendon is, where the force is going to be concentrated, right? So each myofascial unit has its own center of coordination. So these different points are kind of found all the way throughout the body, and they're different for everybody. And it's just going to, again, moderately change not only movement signatures, but ability to produce force and ability to absorb force and change direction. So this is just an interesting point to consider when we're looking at movement and we're analyzing movement. Coming back around here to our big four: elasticity, plasticity, viscosity, and remodeling. So elasticity is the ability to store and release kinetic energy. With this, we're thinking about movements like catapulting, rebounding. Forefoot running is one that Thomas Myers emphasizes often. Ballistic type stretching, oscillatory and perturbative movement. But this is looking at more of the tendinous side of fascial tissue. Plasticity is looking more at the ability to reshape and reform. And a good way to understand plasticity is it's basically the byproduct of elasticity and viscosity, right? But your plasticity is going to be trained in deep, long, isolated stretches, preferably under load, and your soft tissue modalities. And the big key with plasticity is really the time component. It's got to be, something consistent. It's got to be exposed regularly, and you have to continue to build on it, pretty routinely. Viscosity is our ability for tissues to glide smoothly across one another. So for this, we're thinking about, plyometric and impact forces, oscillatory ballistic stretching, and submaximal global movement patterns. Remodeling, again, down here, the ability to adapt and respond to chronic demands. The big part here is the time component again. We're not going to jump on a foam roller and roll out for 4 or 5 minutes twice a week and do anything. Quite frankly, that's just not going to do shit. It's not enough stimulus. It's not enough time. So remodeling is a multifactorial component. And we're looking at like heavy loading consistently, deformation or body tempering. Body tempering is something that I stole directly from Donnie Thompson. I'll post a link on that too. But body tempering has been very successful for me with some of my athletes. And again, responding to consistency positively or negatively. This is a really cool slide here. And a lot going on, but really what we're looking at here is the different receptor types that are found in fascia. So we have our Golgi, Pacini, Ruffini, and our interstitial fibers, or receptors rather. So with the Golgis, we're looking at the myotendinous junction. This is the one most are probably familiar with, but we see Golgi tendon organs are responsive to muscular contraction. And if we know our AMP 101, we know that Golgi tendon organs are the cinder block under our accelerator or the overbearing parent, however you choose to look at it. But basically, it's the emergency shutoff system when our body thinks that we're taking on too much load. So we see here strong stretch is required here, but with the Golgi tendon organs, we want to try to desensitize them and try to get them to not interrupt or impede movement preemptively. When we look at the Pacini fibers, we're still in the myotendinous junction, but where Golgis respond to strong stretches and muscular contractions, the Pacini fibers respond to rapid pressure changes and vibrations. So this is used as proprioceptive feedback. And we were just talking about 6 times the amount of proprioceptive bodies and nerve endings. This is one where I think we overlook this one a little bit too much. So we'll see some of the training applications on this in a minute, but rapid pressure changes and vibrations is not a common training item. Down for the Ruffini fibers, now we're looking at more of the ligaments. And with this, the interesting point that I took away from this is tangential forces or lateral stretching. So, we've already mentioned, multi-directional, multi-planar. We're looking at the Ruffini fibers, which are type 2 fibers, when we're looking at, or when we're thinking about these tangential forces. And the takeaway here, the result here is an inhibition of sympathetic activity. So if we think about, people who are all bound up and, very, high motor tone or vasomotor tone, if we need to down-regulate that, we have to inhibit the sympathetic drive or sympathetic activity. Last one here, the interstitials. The interesting takeaway here is, one, most abundant type of receptor, found everywhere, almost everywhere, even inside bones. The interesting takeaway for me here was 50% are high threshold units, 50% are low threshold. So that speed spectrum that we were talking about, we're looking at the interstitial receptors here. And the takeaway is change in vasodilation, or in other words, ability to get blood flow to where we need it to go. We break down plasticity a little bit deeper here. Really, we're looking at our stress versus strain curve. With that, tissues have a threshold of how much they can tolerate, and for how long they can tolerate it, before they deform past the point of being able to return back to normal. So when we're thinking about plasticity, we want to keep that in the forefront of our mind. This over here is an interesting image, and this study has been published in a couple of different places. But what this is looking at is basically the length changes, both the tendon and the muscle. And the interesting takeaway on this is that that dorsiflexion is really just elastic stretching of the fascial tissue while the muscles contract isometrically. So if you look here at the red next to the muscle fibers, there's not a lot of change in length or movement here, right? This is really just kind of an isometric contraction for the calf muscles. Whereas the tendinous tissue, we're seeing pretty significant changes in length throughout. So something to consider here is, what's the etiology of Achilles tendon tears? Is it because we have a weak, non-compliant tendon, or is it because we have too much of a difference between the muscular strength of the calf and the reflexive properties of the tendon? A lot of Achilles tears actually happen because the muscle is too strong and it pulls isometrically on the tendon, causing the rupture. A basic takeaway from this study was that the pulsing elastic properties of fascia are actually more responsible for power generation in running than muscle, which is pretty interesting. Whole bunch of different factors here. This is not an original graph, and frankly, I completely forgot to cite this one. But this is looking at all of the different variables and kind of the response independently from being overly stiff or tonus. So we're seeing some important ones here. This one I would say stands out to me. If we have an excessive amount of tone or tissue stiffness, the nerve fibers are going to become entrapped, and we're going to kind of impinge on some of the nerves. So, an increased risk for neuromuscular disease. I would take that a step back and just say probably impaired neuromuscular function, but nevertheless not a takeaway that we want. Increased cross-linking. This is an important one. When the fascia is bound up, it constricts the muscle belly. It does not allow the muscle belly to distend and contract as it should, so it's going to create an increase in cross-linking, or what most refer to as trigger points. Probably going to have some negative effects on tissue hydration and HA or hyaluronic acid again, because when we have that constriction, things can't move how they're supposed to move, and that's all we're considering that's what we're primarily considering with viscosity, is that tissue glide. Stretch-induced tissue elongation is going to be impaired because, again, the constriction is not going to allow the muscle to move how it needs to. We're going to get an increased ECM matrix deposit, which is going to then probably have consequences on the lymphatic system or our ability to process toxins. And we're going to probably get an upregulation in cellular contractility because we'll be overfiring because we can't move how we need to. Now looking at remodeling again one more time. I put a PR back squat in my own webinar because I'm a stud. Actually, it's like the only picture I really have. But when we're thinking about remodeling, we're thinking about heavy loading. We're thinking about consistent heavy loading. We're thinking about moving in full ranges of motion. To quote Tom Myers here, remodeling cannot occur until enough new collagen fibers have been laid down. So when we think about laying down new collagen fibers, again, we're thinking heavy load consistently over time. All right, switching gears here now into training considerations. For training considerations, we want to start by having the big picture in mind. I think the big problem with fascia and kind of integrating it into training is when we think about fascia, we think about getting on a foam roller or a Bosu ball or something, and it's not anything specific. It's a part of human movement, production, performance, sport, action, whatever you want to consider it. So we need to continue to have the big picture in mind. And if we look at that in action, we have future NFL MVP Josh Jacobs over here. Just think about how the fascia is involved in this. And I mean, my goodness, it's not even considering, getting to this point of the play, all the ways that the fascial system's involved, but this specifically, being able to resist, rotational torque at the trunk, leg drive through force and contact, contralateral movement, the vestibular balance, the proprioceptive ability. I mean, it's on and on. Another great athlete to look at when we're looking at fascia is Ja Morant. I'd be willing to bet that Ja, as much as I love him, probably can't even back squat 315, 365, but he can absolutely jump out of the gym. It's something Dan Pfaff refers to often as movement signatures and being able to optimize, kind of the fascial system. I think Ja is a really great example of that. And then, down here, even in sports like Olympic weightlifting, we see CJ Cummings, who's been on a tear these last couple of years. When we think about weightlifting, we just think about moving, heavy shit and moving it fast. But, there are limitations to that. And I think that there's more application for fascial training in settings like Olympic weightlifting than we give credence to. And then gymnastics, Simone Biles, the GOAT, this one is pretty easy to see the fascial involvement, in a sport like gymnastics. So now getting into some of the principal training points here, kind of to set the tone here, take a look down in the left corner. If we're looking at neural adaptations, we're looking at about 2 to 4 weeks. Neural adaptations can be pretty quick and pretty responsive. It also, detrains quickly, but, we can get a neural adaptation pretty quickly. Muscular adaptations, we're looking at about 5 to 8 weeks. For fascial adaptations, we're looking at like 1 to 3 years. So again, a lot of this is really just a component of time and consistency, but just keep that in mind as we're going through these. So kind of my 5 big principles here. We're looking at multiplanar, varying speeds under varying loads, with an emphasis on higher speeds and submaximal loading, rhythmic dynamic type actions, contralateral, unilateral base movements, and accommodating stimulus. So multiplanar, pretty self-explanatory, but I like to challenge the planes in isolation first, and then look to blend those cardinal planes and kind of find new vectors. Some of this is a little bit omnidirectional. We've already discussed that, tissues respond differently to different velocities. So, again, I just think about this as a spectrum, and we're going to work slow all the way up to high. And, of course, it being a relative spectrum to the athlete or to the population you're working with, but we want to work across that spectrum. Submaximal loading does tend to be optimal for fascial adaptations, but we're gonna work up to some heavy stuff too. For rhythmic, we're thinking that reflexive strength and stretching, so like low intensity plyos, bounce, skips, hops, throws, contralateral and unilateral movement, locomotive and primitive patterns, emphasis on positional strength and triplanar stability here. And then for accommodating stimulus, we want to challenge proprioception and vestibular systems, oscillatory and perturbations for neural bandwidth, and offset work for an indirect loading, to kind of highlight the weak points of the chain. So another cool little graph here now, putting all of those in play. One thing that is, we talked about on the opening slide. Excuse me. One thing we talked about on the opening slide here, is Stu McGill being kind of cautioning, with stretching, and I do not want to get into the back and forth on benefits of stretching here, just in case Mike Boyle's tuning in or anything. But Stu says you stretch away fascial elasticity, all you're left with is muscle. And what he means by that is you don't want muscles to work for themselves. Muscles are limited in what they can do. Your fascia system is what glues everything together and kind of, in my opinion, optimizes or elucidates movement. So we want to make sure we're not overdoing it on the stretching. Now, if we look at progressing, sling movements or just, training with a fascial emphasis, how do we go about progressing those? Well, we want to start with introductory motor control, big emphasis on movement awareness. This is where I'll do a lot of eccentric work and really not eccentric work in terms of external overload, but eccentric work eccentric loading or work in terms of, getting them to, really feel the path of motion that they're working through. But when we start out, we always, we still always want to start basic and simple. From there, we're going to look to progress the tempos and the positions. So this is where I'll introduce isometric emphasis, long isometric holds. Here we're looking at resisting force. Whereas over here, not to get ahead of myself, but over here, we're going to look at resisting torque. So initially, or preliminarily, we want to work on force management and acceptance. For here, we want to stress individual weaknesses and deficiencies, and again, try to, kind of exploit where the athletes are weak. 3, we're looking at multiplanar. So now we're going to introduce some new vectors. We're going to start to blend cardinal planes of motion, and we're going to introduce some combination patterns. This step comes obviously once we become proficient in each individual plane. Now we're going to start to add some new ones. And then finally, we want to change the stimulus. So this is our introduction to oscillatory and perturbation. Again, emphasis on resisting torque here. So now we're adding angles into the mix. And develop an ability to tolerate variability is really the way I look at it. So this chart here, I didn't put any videos on this, but just know that basically everything that's in here you can find on our YouTube page. We have like over 1,000 videos, so a lot of this stuff can be found in there. But to paint the picture here, we look at 5 very common items in just about anybody's training program, right? And what I notice is a lot of people are doing carries, crawling, lunging, step-ups, chops. A lot of people are doing these, but their progression line stops right about here. Now, I know for a lot of you, especially in the college sector, time is certainly anything but abundant, and you have to be very selective as to what you expose the athletes to or what you have them working on because of that time restriction. That being said, I think that there is a tremendous amount of value in changing these variations rather frequently, especially with higher level athletes and especially with injured athletes. I think higher level athletes adapt to these kinds of things very quickly, and we need to just find ways to continue to challenge them. So with that, if we look at kind of the themes of progression here, we have our baselines across. Our first step is going to be, adding a reach or, adding a tempo, ISO here, pulsing here. This is changing position. Adding an ISO and a golfer would also be changing the position because we're going into more of that trunk flexion or that hinge position. Next progression, we're looking at now introducing offsets or unevens. So, we look at a band offset on a crawl, right, attached around the waist to a fixed anchor point. For carries, we're thinking about, it can be as simple as having a 75-pound dumbbell in one hand and a 25 in the other, or having a barbell overhead with 25 pounds on one side and nothing on the other. For lunges, we're looking at multiplanar offset loading. For step-ups, adding a press into the mix. For chops, instead of going in a rotational or a frontal plane, we're now coming kind of in a transverse or, a transverse chop with a sagittal action. Third progression, now we start to add our perturbations and our oscillatory work, our accommodating resistance. We add rotation into what we're doing, and then we add in, a dynamic or a flexive stimulus for our chops. Final step, now we're looking at vestibular and more proprioceptive input, closing the eyes, adding perturbations to a lunge, adding the uneven barbell into a step up, perturbations again for the chop. So, these are something that I may sequence, across a 12-week training period. We may, hit this for a week or two, spend 3 or 4 weeks here, 1 or 2, 3, 4. It all just depends on what the athletes show you. But, I think that kind of evolving your accessory work or some of your smaller movements can go a long way. Now, speaking more specifically to the slings here, I guess this is kind of becoming like a buzzword, but when we're talking about the slings, there are really 4 primary slings. The deep longitudinal, so that's looking at the erectors down here, all the way up through the biceps femoris. All the way down to the biceps femoris, and all the way up into the lat here. If we look at the posterior sling, we're looking at glute plus contralateral lat. The anterior sling, which isn't really shown here, we're looking at the adductors, and then on the front side, contralateral serratus, and a little bit of pec and oblique. And then the lateral system, we're looking at basically the whole lateral chain. I include the lat in there as well, but lat, adductor, glute, QL, that makes up the lateral chain. So again, anterior internal oblique plus contralateral adductor, posterior lat plus contralateral glute, lateral adductors, glute, QL, and just kind of your baseline, ways to train those or target those, kind of in a foundational format. What I want you to think about, though, is kind of taking those slings and applying them to what we know, right? When we say the slings, I think it kind of creates this like predisposition or almost preconception of like, oh my God, we're doing something different. This isn't something I was taught in college. So what is it? Some of the older strength and conditioning crowd, probably just kind of scoffs at it. Whereas some of the younger crowd probably gets a little bit too excited about it. But the way I look at it is just taking these slings and looking at how they're involved in our 6 load vectors in sport. This is, one of the best images I've come across in a long time. This is what I think about when we think about cardinal planes. These are the different directions that we're moving in sport. And honestly, this is just a basic view, but these slings and the fascial alignment all directly lay or play a factor here in our cardinal planes. And we kind of tie them together here. Your spiral chains, we see everything kind of wraps and envelops around the body. And one thing that, was kind of a profound realization for me is that everything about the human body is helical in nature. Nothing is linear. It's all nonlinear. So, I think that rotational aspects in training have been a little bit short-sighted. But, when we think about offset loading, so holding a 75-pound in this hand and a 25-pound in this hand for a farmer's carry, now we're not only challenging the sagittal action or the locomotive pattern with external load, but we're also challenging these helical spiral chains to keep an upright torso, so basically resisting lateral flexion. And I know that that's a big thing in the football population, especially is, the ability, for an offensive lineman to have somebody coming at just his left shoulder and being able to resist that torque or that force. I think that the spiral chains or the slings are extremely important for that.